Okay, so I'm going to start today just by thanking Nicholas Cook, actually, for the slightly overdramatic title. And I can assure you that my talk is going to be a lot drier than it actually sounds. I was a little bit confused or surprised to be asked to give this talk because I'm not a still manufacturer. But actually, I started thinking about what I was going to talk about by thinking about my short career in the gin industry and my slightly longer career in the chemistry world and the different stills that I have used. So, obviously, I started my career in chemistry. So in the lab, we would use glass stills, such as this. And there were two different uses for the glass still. There was either to sort of maintain reaction conditions or to undergo purification processes. So if we were using a still to maintain a reaction, you'd set up a round bottom flask with your your condenser on the top of the flask, and you'd set up major reflux. And what that allowed you to do was to leave a reaction running at 200 degrees C without it boiling dry, and it would just maintain those conditions. For purification, that was when we were starting to use the different boiling points of compounds to separate them. The most frequently used method was a rotary evaporator. So a rotary evaporator was used to take away waste solvent, a high volatile product, from from our product. And it was actually something that I struggled with when I moved into the gin industry, that everyone was very excited about using rotary evaporators, because for me, they were a waste disposal unit. And then the other method of purification was to take a mixture of compounds with different boiling points and carry out a fractional distillation. And that could either be done under atmospheric or vacuum pressure. And it's actually one of the first things that students at university in chemistry learn how to do. And I taught that for a couple of years in the undergraduate labs. I then moved to Bermondsey Distillery, where I used a copper and steel John Doerr still. So it was a replica of the two stills that Charles Maxwell and his team used down at Thames Distillery. The only difference was that Charles has steam jackets on his stills, and this was a water jacket with an electrical element heating the water. Also at Bermondsey, I don't know where my pointer's gone, there we go. I had a lab, so I had a copper pot still with a worm tub condenser, and I also had a number of different glass stills to carry out smaller gin distillations. Out in Goa, I worked with the Now Spirits team, and we used a Hungarian-made copper and steel pot still with shell and tube condenser, and there was actually a botanical basket, but you can't see it, it's hidden behind the still in this photo. And now at Laverstoke, we have 4 copper stills. They all have shell and tube condensers, they have vapor baskets, because we do vapor infusion, and these two in the picture have cast heads. And the final still is our newest one, which is in the middle here, and this is our Oxley still. So it's on a 100-litre stainless steel vacuum still. It's chilled by a water glycol mix, and it has a polycold heat exchanger 2-stage condenser. Now, for an 100-litre still, it has a remarkably large footprint. So actually, in the picture, all you're seeing is the receiver vessel, because I couldn't actually get my phone to fit it all in. The other thing I'd like to say is it is an enormous topic. This is not something I'm going to be able to cover with 4 samples and 20 minutes to talk about. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to touch on a couple of items that I think might affect the way your gin tastes, purely down to still design. But first, I'm going to address this idea of a traditional still. So I'm sure you're all aware that the old EU regulations stated that to have a distilled or a London dry gin, you had to use a still that was traditionally used for gin, or where I copied and pasted the definition, they said it was through traditional stills for ethyl alcohol. Now, the word traditional is really kind of misleading. The definition is that it's habitually used, done, or found. And for me, a traditional gin, when you say traditional still, it conjures up this picture of this battered copper still over an open flame somewhere in an old city. And actually, the whole terminology is open to interpretation. There's no real definition of how long something has to be used for before it's considered habitual or before it's considered traditional. And therefore, I thought it was kind of unhelpful in the definition, but you'll all be very relieved to know that the new EU definitions, the new EU regulations have completely dropped that from the definition of both distilled gin and London dry gin. So we can use whatever stills we like to make London dry gin, which is great. However, it did pique my interest, so I did what I normally do when I want to find a little bit about history of gin. I hit up David, and I also Googled a few things, and I found out just what stills were used traditionally or have been used in the past. Like I said, copper's what we always think of. But actually, in terms of material, back in early distilling in Asia, they were using clay or porcelain pot stills with bamboo condensers, which I thought was rather lovely. Tin, iron, pewter, brass, and wood are all mentioned as commonly used still materials. And even in the Scotch whisky industry, once copper was ubiquitous, you still found distillers who kept the body of the still as tin or iron and just had copper in the condenser. And my favourite reference was to early distilling in India, where they had clay pot stills with copper heads. But because it's hot in India and they wanted to increase the reflux at the copper head, they packed the head with damp cow dung, which I thought was ingenious. All of the stills were of a similar shape. So you had a very similar sort of classic pot still with condenser and a line arm. Condensers tended to be worm-tub condensers, and they tended to be heated over an open flame. And it wasn't until technology moved on a little bit that we got shell and tube condensers coming in, and also steam jackets for slightly more diffuse and even heating. And I actually thought the most recent technology for distilling would be vacuum distilling. I thought that was the one gin, that I made, certainly, that could potentially have a question mark over whether it could call itself a London Dry. If you're making using a vacuum still, is it a traditional still? Here, David put me to rights, and I probably should have known this, but in the first mention of vacuum distillation is in 1680 by Boyle of Boyle's Law, and it has been used widely since, although not necessarily for gin, but I know gin makers, if there's a way of making gin that they can use, they're going to explore it. So, following that and thinking about the history of gin, I tried to break this topic down into three main areas in terms of what properties you think about when buying a still. First one is material and shape. The second one is heat source. And the third one is where and how the botanicals meet the spirit. And I'm going to start with material. So, whenever you think of a gin still, you tend to think of copper. And certainly in the whiskey industry, copper is essential to whiskey production. Gin, it's less essential. And actually what you see in the gin industry is you're getting far more people using a combination of copper and steel. Often, the copper is ornamental because copper's expensive, but people expect to see it. So it's just cladding on the outside of the still. You're also seeing a lot of glass stills, probably because of the rise of vacuum distillation, but also people are making gin on a much smaller basis, and it's quite easy to contact a local lab suppliers and get a small glass still and get set up. So, for the purpose of this talk, I've chosen the three materials, copper, stainless, and glass, to use when making my samples. And conveniently, they're the three materials that I have lab stills made out of. Copper removes sulfur from spirit. We all know this. However, it'll only do that if you have sulfur in there to begin with. So if you're making a gin from a neutral grain spirit with no sulfur compounds, that's not the reaction or the interaction that copper's having with your spirit. It does have an effect, and I know that people are very tied to the fact that copper has an effect, even down to my team at Laverstoke, who, when they were commissioning the stills, the vapor baskets or the botanical baskets in the vapor infusion chamber were made out of stainless steel, and they weren't getting the Bombay taste off the still until they changed the baskets to copper. So something is happening there, but what? I think the most important property of any still material is going to be its thermal conductivity. Okay, thermal conductivity is the measure of the way energy moves through a material. And for copper, steel, and glass, the relative thermal conductivities are 350, 14, and 1, respectively, and that's measured in watts per Kelvin meter. Everyone knows that materials are great electrical conductors, and they're great heat conductors for exactly the same reason, and it's all due to their structure. Metals are made up of a lattice, a very regular lattice of positive atoms, within which there is a sea of electrons. Now, heat transfer takes place by the vibration of those atoms and passing it from atom to atom, but also the electrons can rapidly carry heat through the structure, passing heat along down through the material. Steel is a less good conductor than copper because it is an alloy. So in that lattice, you don't have identical atoms forming a very, very sort of rigid array. What you have is different sized atoms, so you've got irregularity there. And it's that irregularity that hinders the movement of free electrons and lessens the thermal conductivity of steel. Non-metals, such as glass or ceramic or clay, they don't have free electrons, so any thermal energy transfer is through interaction through vibration of atoms, and that's what makes them poor conductors. But what does this mean for your gin? When you're putting heat onto a still, you're trying to do a couple of things. You're trying to boil the liquid, and then you're trying to maintain a boil. So what the thermal conductivity of your still is going to do is control how quickly you get to a boil, and then how much energy you need to put into the still to keep it at a boil. For a steep and boil gin, where your botanicals are in that liquid, if you have a poor conductor, you're going to be heating slightly slower, and I am talking slightly here, than a metal still. The chances are that you're going to get slightly more flavor extraction, but you're also at the risk of slightly stewing those botanicals. So you've got a bit of a careful balance to make to try and get the flavor extraction that you want. And actually that's sort of held out in the industry by the fact you really only see glass on a production level when you've got vacuum distillation, so you're not that fussed about thermal energy at that point. And you also got, or you're in a lab still, so you're just trying to get yourself an indication of what's happening. And oftentimes you'll see a glass lab still lagged with foil to try and increase the thermal conductivity. For a vapor-infused gin, obviously that's less important because you don't care what's happening on the still. All the magic goes on in the infused basket. All you need to do is to get that liquid boiling and get the vapor into the vapor infusion basket. So for a vapor infused gin, I don't think the material is as important. The material in the vapor infusion baskets, however, is, because once the vapor hits a cold vapor infuser basket, it's going to condense. And the amount of time it takes for those vapor baskets to heat up so that the vapor passes through the chamber and takes the flavors is what's important. And that's probably what explains the difference at Laverstoke. I wasn't there at the time, but that's probably what they were finding at Laverstoke when they were going through commissioning. So I'm going to go on to the first samples. Before you neck them, okay, please keep them because all four need to be compared against each other because they are all exactly the same gin. They are a mixture of juniper, coriander, angelica, and lemon peel. They've all been, they all had the same recipe to start with. They had the same cuts. They've been blended to 40% ABV. The only difference between them is the still used. Okay, so samples 1 and 2. As steep and boiled gins. Awesome. Have a nose and a taste. One has been made in a copper lab still, and one has been made in a glass. And on the slide behind me, I have a GC trace of the two gins. Now, a GC trace doesn't tell you exactly how much of any compound is in a gin. What it tells you is the relative amounts of the different compounds in the gin. You can see from this, well, actually, I've labelled the peaks for you all. So you've got alpha pinene and beta pinene, mainly from juniper. You've got limonene, which is mainly from lemon. And you've got sabanine and myrcene, which is from most botanicals, but also mainly from angelica and coriander. Okay? And what you can see here, and I realized as I color-coded this and I'd finished my presentation that I'd color-coded the glass trace in a copper color and the copper color blue. just go with it. So the copper color is at the back. That's the blue trace. So the traces are overlaid, so they're a bit difficult to make out. But you can see here that the relative peaks of all the copper, they're all in the same place. So you've got the same botanicals in there, and really they're in the same ratio as well. So they're all coming off the still at a similar ratio. What you're seeing is in the copper sample, there is relatively more than in the glass. I don't know whether you can taste that. Sorry, yes, I didn't tell you. Sample 1 is copper and sample 2 is glass. Okay. Yeah, definitely on the nose. Yeah. just going to park that for a moment, and I'm going to go on to the next topic, which is your heat source. So I've broken this down into 3 different types of heat. You've got your direct heat, such as open flame or electrical element. You've got indirect heat, such as water jacket or a steam jacket. And then you've got what I called no heat, which is vacuum. So when you cool everything down and it's done at very cold temperatures. One of the things I'm not going to discuss today is all of the many reasons why you might choose one of these heating methods, such as cost, safety, sustainability, all these different things. Just looking purely on what it might do to taste. If you think of a direct heat, we've talked about the fact that what your heat is trying to do is it's trying to boil the liquid, it's trying to maintain the boil, but the other thing that happens while you're boiling and heating is you're starting to get some extraction of flavour. Okay? So as the heat increases, flavour extraction increases. The slower the heat, you're going to get a slow, more steady extraction of flavour. The faster the heat, you're going to get a more rapid extraction of flavour, but you're also then not sort of keeping those delicate molecules floating around in the liquid as the still gets to boiling point. It's going to distill off and over. For a direct heat, you're probably going to get to a boil much, much quicker. But certainly for a steep and boil gin, particularly if it is a very high multifold and you've got a hell of a lot of botanicals in the still, you're going to be risking scorching of botanicals and starting to get some caramelization of the botanicals coming over and some off notes potentially in your gin. For indirect, it's a much more diffuse, much more even way of heating, but you're also then risking that stewing point that I was making with the poor conductors, because you've got those botanicals sitting in that liquid for quite some time as it gets up to heat. And I think that's where you're sort of having to make the careful balance. Flavour compounds, whenever you... Actually, that's one point I didn't make, was, again, for vapour infusion, none of this matters. Flavour compounds are susceptible to undergo change when they are heated. And their ability to undergo that change is a property of the chemical structure, but it's also directly proportional to the amount of time it's left heating and the amount of thermal energy you're putting in. So the longer and hotter you heat your gin, the more likely you are to start to damage some of the delicate flavour molecules that you want. Thermal degradation of a flavour compound happens via internal changes to the chemical structure, via reaction with other compounds around them in the mixture, and also via loss through volatility, which in gin making would be it's coming off in the wrong portion of your gin. So you're either going to cut it out or you're going to keep it in whether you want it or you don't want it. Limonene, pinene, linalool, all these compounds that we talk about as flavour compounds in gin, they all have chemical structures that are very susceptible to undergo isomerization, polymerization, rearrangement, and oxidative reactions. They're what we would call delicate compounds in a chemistry lab, the things you have to treat with respect. Sample 3 then, and you have to compare sample 3 to sample 2, please. Sample 3 is a vacuum gin. So this has been made on a Ropu evaporator, so it's a glass material, but it's vacuum. So if you compare, and it's steep and boil. So if you compare it to sample 2, which is also a steep and boil, but it is in glass, and again, I have the GC traces on the screen behind me, and this time, the vacuum still comes out slightly lower than the glass still. And I think you can taste that. I certainly could when I was tasting them earlier. The vacuum one is much, much lighter, much, much fresher, much, much brighter. The glass still tends to be there's definitely a bit more of the spicy notes, the rooty notes coming through there, which is sort of missing from the vacuum still. And this got me thinking, if we're moving from copper to glass to not heating, what's going on? And honestly, I've only run these 3 samples and run 3 GCs, so I can't make any sweeping scientific statements here. But what I think you might be happening when you're using your stills is you've got this careful balance. You want optimal flavour extraction, but you want minimal thermal degradation. So for a copper, you're going to have potentially you're going to heat up quicker, so you might get slightly less flavour extraction, but you're heating up quicker, so the pathways for thermal degradation are less likely to occur. Glass, You heat up slower, more thermal extraction, more extraction of flavour, but more thermal degradation because you're there, you're stewing those botanicals, they're sat around, they've got time to do, the compounds have got time to start to undergo changes. Vacuum, it's cold. You're going to get less flavour extraction, but you're also not going to get thermal degradation. And that, I think, is why the vacuum still almost feels, in comparison with a steep heated gin, feels slightly less complex, slightly almost thinner on flavour. And I think that's because we're used to tasting some of those thermal degradation compounds. Okay. Which takes me on to the shape of your still. Now, I'm sure you're all aware that the shape of your still is the stuff of legends in the whiskey industry. You hear stories of people banging old dents into new stills to try and keep the flavour. And in the whiskey industry, that's all to do with two things. That's copper contact and the amount of reflux. In gin, reflux is only going to matter again when you come to a steep and boil gin. Vapour infusion's free from this one as well. The more reflux you get, the lighter and brighter gin you get. Similar to a whiskey. More reflux, the lighter, the cleaner the whiskey. So in still 1 versus still 2, still 1's got a nice fat neck, lots of room for the vapour to go up there without hitting the walls and condensing back down and refluxing and flowing back down into the still. Still 2, narrow and tall. Chances are a lot of the spirit's going to reflux up down. You're going to get much more reflux going on. Stills 2, 3, and 4 all have line arms that are pointed up, which means that they act like an extension to the neck. Any vapour that condenses in these arms will roll back down into the still, and it actually acts like a sort of extension of reflux. Still 1, your line arm's pointing down. Any vapour that condenses in that line arm is going to go straight down into your condenser and be collected. Less reflux. Equally, on stills 3 and 4, you've got these features of the still that interrupt like the clean lines of the still, and that increases reflux. So will change the flavour of the spirit you get out at the other end. For condensers, there's 2 main types of condensers, worm tub and shell and tube. So I hadn't actually seen, apart from my small lab still, I hadn't actually seen a worm tub condenser in a production facility until I went up to Craigellachie in Speyside. The worm tub bars are on the roof of the distillery, and it was a freezing cold day when I was up there. There's steam coming off them. They look like hot tubs. They're amazing, but they wouldn't let me get in. But what they say for a worm tub condenser is that you've got less copper contact than with a shell and tube condenser. So you get this bolder, bigger, more sulphurous spirit. That doesn't matter for the gin, because, like we said earlier, as long as you're using Nutrigrain spirit, you don't care about sulphur. So I think you find in the gin industry, most people have a shell and tube condenser. And I personally feel, and this is just purely an opinion, that the importance of the condenser is less. And I think you have to worry about what's happening in the still, your flow rate, and the cuts you make. Your condenser can do what it's like as long as it's condensing the liquid. So the final point is where your botanicals go into your still. Again, 3 different ways. You've got steep and boil, sit in the liquid and you heat them up. Vapour infusion, I've sort of divided this up into 2 different types. So you've got racking, where the baskets sit above the liquid line, but they're still in the body of the still. Or botanicals, and this is what we have at Laverstoke, where they sit halfway down the line arm. So they're nowhere near the still, they're nowhere near the heating element or the liquid. And this last one I actually just invented the name for. It's basically when people say, oh, what kind of still should I buy? I always say make it as versatile as possible. You know, if you can put botanicals in the still, in a rack, and halfway down the line arm in a vapor arm, you can treat the botanicals in an optimal way. And I'm sure you've all had the conversation in an interview where you've talked about the versatility of gin, and that's what makes it great, because you can use whatever botanicals you want, as long as juniper's in there. Fine, but why don't we start using the botanicals in a way they want to be treated and optimize to get the best flavors out of them? And this still, that I invented, allows you to do that. So, in terms of harshness of conditions, obviously, your steep and boil is quite robust. Boiling in liquid, lots of other compounds there. Racking, you're sat above the liquid, you're still in the direct heat line. And then vapour infusion is probably the least harsh. Sample 4, is the vapor infused. And I just want to clarify, when I say vapor infused, it's not like the Laverstoke vapor infusion. The lab still that I was using is much more like racking. So you've got the round bottom flask and a neck going up, and there's a glass mesh halfway up the neck where the botanicals sit. So it's much more like racking than the Laverstoke one. And again, I've got the GC traces of the two. So again, I mean, you can now drink them all and compare them. But if you compare sample 4 and sample 2, then you're comparing the exact same. You're both glass. One's vapor infusion, one's steep and boil. In this, and this, honestly, I did not set this up, and it did surprise me. I can honestly say I was surprised that the vapor infusion of all the samples came out with the highest concentration of botanicals across, which surprised me because I would have thought that steep and boil would have come out with more, and vacuum, I didn't know what vacuum was going to do, to be honest, and vapor infusion would sit sort of in the middle. It came out as the top. And this comes back to, I think, what I was talking about before, where you've got the balance of flavor extraction versus thermal degradation. So in vapor infusion, you've got the heat, so you're getting the flavor extraction, but you're not sat boiling in liquid, so the pathways for thermal degradation are less. So potentially, and again, this is just potentially, it might be that you're getting slightly more flavor and less thermal degradation in a vapor infusion situation, which means that what you get in the gin, for the final gin, means fewer of the compounds that we pick up on a GC have undergone degradation, and they're more visual. Okay? I don't know whether you can taste that. I certainly thought that the sample was slightly more waxy, slightly more oily. I thought there was less difference between this and the steep and boil than there was between the vacuum and the steep and boil. I thought the vacuum was the most different sample. So, and it's not gone blue. That's actually me at the end of my talk. Like most things in the gin making world, there is no right or wrong answer. And certainly what I've said today is no scientific facts. Please don't quote this back at me in 2 years' time. I think that actually as gin distillers, unlike the whiskey industry, we've got more control over the flavour of our gin when we choose our recipe, when we choose how to treat our botanicals, and when we choose our cuts. Our still is important and it will make changes, but I think that there's more control over the other three. Finally, I'd just like to thank these people. So Sam Carter, unfortunately at Laverstoke, I don't actually have any lab stills. I lied. They're all Sam Carter's, so he let me use them. Dr. Lee Courtney, who's in the audience today, is my spirit quality technician. He ran the GCs and also blended the samples for me. David for his history, and David's dad for making me the steel still.